Right, hello! So a couple weeks ago, when the preview patch notes came out, I recorded my reactions to them and live speculated about what they might mean for the game, what they might mean for various builds, and that did kind of well. So now that we have the real patch notes, I thought, why not do a summary rundown type of thing? Now, a good chunk of this is still going to be speculation, however, between having the real patch notes now, actually being able to check in-game, and people having done a little bit of thinking and math in between the preview patch notes and now, there is at least a little more information available. I'm not going to go over every single change. This is more of a highlight reel of stuff that affects endgame PvE builds, and I'm talking fractals, raids, that sort of thing, because I am not the source of information you want for PvP and World vs. World things. I don't know enough about those game modes. I would be a very unreliable narrator. And for everything outside of the group content stuff, things aren't balanced around that. I don't have a whole lot to discuss on that end. Now, the patch notes themselves, and whenever the wiki notes release with the icons, I'll have that in the description for you, as well as potential additional resources I might bring up through the video, as well as the class chapter marker thingies. I also try to get some test footage and some screenshots from any new inclusions and changes from in-game, so you can look at those, and you can pull up the patch notes to read along as well. Also, I don't usually talk about this, because it's not what I make the content for, but I'm working on this probably late into the evening on a workday night, because I wanted to get it out as fast as I could, so if you found any of this helpful or informative, liking and subscribing would actually be really appreciated. I'd like to know if this is worth doing again in the future. Cool? Cool. Then let's actually finally look at the patch. Now let's look at some of the class non-specific changes, jumping right in with one of the more controversial ones for the patch, the confusion changes. So confusion is getting altered. Essentially, the passive flat damage checks of it are getting buffed by roughly 66%, while the procs that happen whenever something attacks are getting nerfed by 66%. This is less of a big deal than people might have you believe. I will discuss this in more detail in the Mesmer, specifically the Mirage section, because that's what's the most affected by this. The idea behind it is that confusion-heavy builds, namely Mirage, were overperforming heavily on fights that could proc confusion many times, while in turn underperforming on fights that weren't proccing confusion a lot. This will bring all performance of confusion much closer to a middle point between the two. Overall, it's completely fine. It doesn't make anything unviable anywhere. It's just overperforming less in certain places. Again, I'll give more details on this in the Mirage section. You can think what you want about this diminishing the identity of confusion. I don't want to give a judgment on that. Moving on. In a similar vein of making things more consistent, you will now always be treated as flanking when you're fighting a foe that has a Defiance bar, meaning every single raid boss there is. This affects mostly Ranger and Thief, which have traits that benefit from flanking, but also anybody who might be wanting to use Thief runes. Now, generally, Eagle runes are still going to be better in a lot of cases, unless you can actually make use of all the extra crit from Thief runes. So overall, this is a consistency buff for a couple of builds on a couple of bosses where you're not just stacking on the boss's ass anyway. Now, last for the general changes, they are doing the rest of the cooldown reduction traits. For those that don't remember, last balance patch, they started removing all of the traits that give you cooldown reduction on specific utility skills, and they are following through on that, getting rid of the rest of them essentially. This takes up a huge chunk of the patch notes, a ton of the notes are just a result of this, and I'm putting this here because it has roughly the same amount of impact on all of them, which is very minor. They've been pretty good about making the cooldown changes baseline for skills that were already being used with the trait, or that were kind of already weak, or just some utility options that won't have a major impact. But leaving the skills unchanged that were already decently strong, but weren't used in conjunction with the trait. So this shouldn't affect a ton, but it does result in a couple reworked traits. Now let's take a look at LE, who isn't getting a ton, but some nice minor changes. The Signet, Glyph, and Arcane skill traits are getting their cooldown reduction removed. The Arcane trait is otherwise staying the same, The Glyph trait now also grants resistance on Glyph cast, and the Signet trait now also gives you an aura when you cast a Signet based on which Signet you used. Also, the Dagger skills are getting some updates, with Fire Dagger 5 and Air Dagger 5 now both covering more area, and Earth Dagger 5 being reworked. From the long casting skill that it was, that has slightly reduced damage, but due to the much faster casting time is going to be easier to use and also just fits better with Dagger. That's it for Core LE. Tempest is getting some very needed buffs, reworking the Tempestuous Aura traits, which now instead of applying weakness on Shout, you instead get a damage buff every time you grant an aura. And it does say apply to an ally, but it still counts if it's only yourself. This does conflict with the trait that gives you stability and overload, but this is a much appreciated damage buff to all version of non-healing Tempest that was quite needed. Additionally, Alacrity duration from Lucid Singularity has also been increased by 1.5 times, which means you need a lot less boon duration and can be a lot safer with it. Weeva isn't getting anything interesting, it's all PvP changes, so let's move on to Catalyst. Catalyst is getting 2 relevant changes. One, the trait that makes your Jade Sphere apply boons, now always gives quickness regardless of your attunement, though less of it, with Air Attunement now instead granting Fury. This makes the whole thing easier to play, and may mean that the rotations between Power Catalyst and Quickness Catalyst become the same, though that might not necessarily happen due to some trait things. Should be easier to play, still very fast-paced, it's more a usability change than a buff. Also, Air Hemaphore no longer throws you backwards. It instead now gives you super speed, which is far less funny, but a lot easier to use. Now, Engineer, who's getting even fewer changes. The huge block of changes that Core Engineer has is pretty much all cooldown based, with elixirs, gadgets, and the basically never used toolkit all getting their cooldown reduction traits changed, but they don't get any new effects or anything. The one core change that does exist is Med Blaster, the heal kit auto, having reduced range. To get to the interesting part, Scrapper. In line with them wanting to move boon application away from utility skills, their quickness trait is getting reworked. Now, instead of applying whenever you use a gyro, you now grant 3 seconds of quickness whenever you execute a blast or a leap finisher. And also it makes your gyro a blast finisher, and you now get even more concentration from your power than before. Now this only affects Quickness Scrapper so much. Hammer 3 is already a leap finisher, Gyro is getting the blast finisher, and Blast Gyro is obviously also a blast finisher. However, you might now be inclined to take Bomb Kit over Grenade Kit for the extra finisher. However, this does negatively impact Heal Scrapper, who normally brings a lot fewer of those finishers in its build, and will severely limit its utility options. Hollowsmith is only getting a small bug fix, nothing to talk about here, and Mechanist is having the range penalty for the mech reworked again. Now instead of the mech no longer inheriting your stats, your F skills will now have a longer cooldown if the mech is farther away from you. This shouldn't change a ton. Overall, it should be less punishing for DPS mechanists, and a little more annoying for support mechanists to deal with. The other thing that's getting changed is Barrier Burst. The F3 will now grant more barrier, while Mech Core Barrier Engine, the trait, now granting less passive barrier, which should roughly even out. Guardian has even less going on. I swear they're not all like this, but all of the core changes and the Dragon Hunter changes are just the cooldowns. They still had all of their cooldown reduction traits, now all of those effects are gone. And none of those traits are getting additional effects either. As I've said before, this shouldn't really change anything. The one thing to look out for is that some of the non-DPS utility-based skills, like Stand Your Ground, are getting their cooldown removed baseline despite not normally being used with the trait, meaning utility options on Guardian have been buffed slightly. That's also the only thing Dragon Hunter gets. Meanwhile, Firebrand is similarly only getting a change to the Mantra trait, which now also doesn't grant cooldown reduction anymore, but all the cooldowns are becoming baseline, which was not in the original patch notes. This trait isn't getting a new effect, but its current effect is getting buffed, and it now gives you 2 pages instead of 1, whenever you use a final charge. This is a slight buff to all DPS versions of Firebrand. Willbender doesn't even have any notes. Now instead, let's move on to Mesmer, who is actually getting interesting things. Core Mesmer is mostly getting PvP changes, with the one thing that might be noteworthy being Signet of Humility having its cooldown halved, which might give it some use in corner cases, instead of being completely worthless. To get to the interesting parts, Chronos' boon application has been reworked, untying it from both shield and wells. Both alacrity and quickness now work the same way. If you have the relevant trait, you will now apply the boon whenever you either shatter or summon a phantasm. Some of the wells are also getting slightly buffed, but nothing too relevant. One thing to note is that the preview patch notes said they would add alacrity to one of the wells, however they have removed this, possibly because currently alacrity DPSs are balanced to do less damage than quickness, so they are giving alacrity one less boon source, that way you have to take slightly more boon duration and do slightly less damage as a result. In my opinion, Chrono is still going to be struggling after this as a boon support because you don't apply any secondary boons, which is kind of expected now of all supports. Mirage is also getting some rather impactful stuff. I talked about the confusion changes at the start of this, and I will now throw up some damage numbers. User Tipcat, who is a Mesmer-focused benchmarker for the Crits and Dips Guild, has already done the math on how this will work out for Mirage. As expected, it is a huge damage loss on extremely high action speed bosses like the Largos Twins and Cairn, but a significant buff on bosses that barely proc confusion like Doom and Deimos. Overall, you're losing an average of 2% damage across all bosses combined. However, this isn't exactly true because the calculation is using each of the Largos Twins individually, so the total average might actually be closer to 0. As I said at the top, this is not a nerf. What is an explicit nerf is that the condition duration of the condis done by the staff ambush used specifically by the clones is getting halved, and this is where the major damage loss in the calculations that should be on screen are coming from. However, the resulting numbers on the bosses are similar to what other alacrity DPS supports are currently putting out, so Mirage is far from dead. You could argue it might have been a bit secretly broken up till now, and now it's just kind of average. Virtuoso is also getting some utility-based changes. This one's a bit weird. So the shatters, the F4 and F5, will now effectively give you less defensive options. F5 no longer blocks, and F4 gives you less distortion duration. The dagger skills, however, have been reworked to make them easier to hit, which should be on screen right now. The psychic utility skills have also been slightly buffed, basically across the board. Right, Necro. So for Necro, I'm doing this in a slightly different order to get the stuff that's easy to explain out of the way first, and then address the elephant in the room. You'll see what I mean in a second. So for Core, the Signet trait is getting reworked entirely. This used to be a cooldown-based trait, and now instead of letting you keep your Signet passives while you're in Shroud, it now makes Signets remove boons, which is just kind of random. Also, a bunch of the skills that used to convert boons into conditions now instead just strip them. This is a PvP-orientated change, and will hardly matter. Dagger 2 has also been reworked. It is no longer a channel skill, instead now applying a dot after casting, which then also heals you over time. Which is quite nice. Channel skills are not great. Reaper isn't getting any changes, so I'm jumping over Scourge and onto Harbinger for a second, where the Elixir trait is having its cooldown removed, which I'm talking about specifically because the elixirs, despite being used with the trait, are not getting their cooldowns reduced, which is a nerf to Quickness Harbinger. Also, the Condi trait that conflicts with this one is getting its condition damage increase cut in half, which, considering Condi Harbinger's benchmark right now, is warranted. Okay, I've danced around it enough. Scourge is getting major changes, and they are not going over well. I don't want to go over all of these changes individually, because they kind of all feed into each other, but the important parts are Scourge is now getting a trait that will apply Alacrity whenever you apply Barrier, and another one that also grants them Might when you give Barrier. This means that support Scourge versions can now actually provide meaningful boons. To compensate for this, they have significantly nerfed blood magic's ability to res people, essentially. Because the trade-off before was that if you're using a support Scourge, people can't die, but you're also using a team slot on a build that doesn't do any boons and doesn't really do a whole lot of damage. This is not a popular change, though personally I think it is for the better. Opinion alert, but Support Scourge in its current state was not sustainable. Support Scourge's role has always been that of a hard carry for groups of less experienced or less skilled players. Which in itself is fine, but as time has gone on, those types of players have gotten additional resources to do that job for them without a Scourge, such as the extra health given by a Jade bot, the introduction of Emboldened mode, and the general increased availability of res skills on other healers like Druid. So gradually, that niche of Scourge was becoming more and more irrelevant. It was just a matter of time before people accepted it. It was not a sustainable place to be. It is unfortunate to completely lose this unique aspect of the class, but it does give the builds a lot of longevity. However, its current implementation is riddled with a lot of problems. One of the changes I haven't talked about yet is that your shades have had their duration nerfed from 20 seconds to 8. This is awful. There is no two ways about this. This is possibly the worst change in the patch, and one that I was desperately hoping they wouldn't actually let through. Nerfing the duration of the shades is a major nerf to all versions of Scourge, despite only impacting them indirectly. It is the one thing I genuinely hope just gets straight up reverted still. I don't have much more to say about this. That's just bad. Heal Scourge is probably not viable after this. That sounds a bit mean to say, and I don't like speculating about these things before they actually go through, but in changing them from their specific little niche to a standard Alacrity healer, they kind of forgot to give them a couple of the baseline tools that those need. First off, they don't have any sources of protection. Second, they only have a very awkward way to apply stability, and no sources of burst healing whatsoever. It is meant to be offset by the existence of Barrier, but they also massively reduced one of your biggest barrier applicants in the F3 with this patch, which also seems extremely weird. So in general, Heal Scourge is just less usable than other healers in its same role. But pretty much all of these things are actually decently easy to fix. So as long as ANET is paying attention, it shouldn't be too bad for too long. Meanwhile, Alacrity DPS Scourge might be genuinely pretty decent, as a very flexible and fairly utility-heavy version of an Alacrity DPS. One thing that I didn't know where to put anywhere in this Scourge talk thingy is that the Serpent Siphon skill has also been reworked. It now looks like this, and does a ton of things, including doing damage, boon stripping, barrier, regen, and being the Aegis source for support Scourge. Now moving on from the doozy that is Scourge, ANET's not giving me any breaks because Ranger's up next and is getting the most amount of new stuff. Alright, Ranger is getting a lot of stuff reworked. First off, Sword. Both the 2 and the 3 are now completely different skills. They're playing in the background. They won't be here for very long because we have a lot of stuff to talk about, so enjoy them while they last. I can't say anything as to their effectiveness, but they do seem a lot easier to use, which might make Sword actually relevant. Also, the Sword trait has been reworked to go along with this, which now gives you power, and more power if you're using a sword instead of its previous effects. Next, Spirits. A lot of stuff is getting changed in Nature Magic as a trait line, including the complete removal of Alacrity from that, and Spirits are also getting completely reworked. How they function isn't very well explained in the patch notes, so I will do that instead. Instead of being something you summon and then have to keep around, they are now a normal skill. They are a ground target, you put them down somewhere, they then perform an attack that applies boons and does something else. None of these are too interesting in their effects. I should be hovering over them in the footage, hopefully. Notably, all your important boons are accounted for, and Stone Spirit is now also an Aegis source. The reason there is a distinction between them pulsing boons on summon and them using the skill that they do is that the Spirit trait makes them use the attacking skill twice, but it does not let them apply their boons twice. which is important to note. Nature magic in general is getting a bunch of changes. It's kind of all utility based. The only other one I wanted to call out is lingering magic, which now also increases the healing that your regen does. Further, the cooldown reduction from the trap and the command trait have been removed, though they are not getting anything else. Also, Farsighted in marksmanship is getting buffed to do more damage in melee range, which is a buff mainly meant for Untamed, for reasons we'll get to. Now, with Alacrity no longer on a core spec, a lot of things in the elite specializations are being moved around. Druid is getting a lot of stuff. First off, Grace of the Land now no longer gives you Might, instead granting Alacrity on all of your Celestial Avatar skills, proccing 1 second anytime they affect anything. People have said that this might be a bit low, so we'll have to see how that works out. Also, CA 4 and 5 have gotten additional Might added to compensate for losing it on Grace of the Land. Lingering Light as the Extreme Healing Grandmaster has also been reworked, so that it now reduces the cooldown of your other CA skills whenever you heal somebody while you're in CA. Still staying on the support topic, the CA one has an increased radius, and Glyph of Equality now applies stability while you're not in CA. Last change that still affects this version of the build is that passive Astral Force generation has been increased by a little over half. And I say this version of the build because for the first time ever, you actually have choices with Druid. Because they have introduced 3 new traits, which make a Condi build genuinely possible outside of the little speed clearing niche it had in the past. I can't say how well these are gonna work. People better than me at benchmarking are gonna have to try these properly, but they look really interesting, that's for sure. Soul Beast isn't getting anything too big. The Dagger 3 is getting a minor rework. It is no longer an ammo skill, but now has a lower cooldown, and does poison. Cool. Untamed, on the other hand, is also essentially getting a rework entirely based on 1 trait. Yeah, so Fervent Force, the thing that reduced your cooldowns every time you CC'd, is completely gone. It no longer exists. Instead, it has been replaced by a new trait called Let Loose, which will share an entire 7 seconds of quickness every time you use an ambush skill. It also resets your ambush cooldown whenever you swap weapons. The general cooldown of the ambush skills has also been reduced from 15 to 9 seconds, while all of the power ambush skills have had their damage increased. Also, your F skills have had their cooldown reduced, but that's not really a big deal. This completely redefines how Untamed is going to play. The endless CC conga line that resulted in you basically having no cooldowns as long as you're doing the exact rotation exactly correctly is completely gone. It no longer exists. You are now going to be playing around your ambush skills instead, in both the new quickness version of the build and the existing DPS versions. We'll see how the Condi one works out after this. To be honest, this was inevitable. I said this in my patch reaction video. Fervent Force, as cool as it was and as unique as it was going to be infinitely causing problems for them on the balancing side. It was a cool idea, but this was never actually sticking around. This was not a problem on the DPS side of things, where it was actually reasonably manageable to balance. It was a problem on the utility side of things, because for one, it gave you basically 0 cooldown utility skills, or almost 0 cooldown utility skills, which could trivialize certain mechanics, and it also has always affected special action keys, which kind of break fights like Mursat Overseer. It would also be a complete nightmare to balance going forward, as they have talked about that they want to introduce non-elite specialization-based expansions to your combat options with the future expansion models. It was impossible to keep Fervent Force around and do that as well, because it would always break something. It would also always break special action keys, which would have caused major issues sooner or later, so they're now getting rid of it, and Untamed is basically a new spec. I'm sorry to the people who love the old Untamed, but it's gone. Right, finally I get another short one, with Revenant. Core is getting almost exclusively PvP changes, don't have anything to talk about with this. Herald, however, is getting its boon application reworked, because, again, they want to move them away from the facets and onto something else. Something else in this case being upkeep. Elevated Compassion now pulses 3 seconds of quickness every 3 seconds, as long as you're using 6 pips of upkeep, aka you're going -1 on your energy generation. Personally, I absolutely hate this change. The working theory, at least at the Snowcrow's help desk, that the optimal way to play Quickness Herald will now be to use Jalis and Shiro, and simply stick on the hammers or impossible odds, depending on which one you're in, and just auto and maybe use the 2. I think this is a horrible way to do this. It's incredibly boring. It also, if they were right, which might not necessarily be the case but could be, would mean that Glint is irrelevant for the support version of this, and that's just kind of really sad. I really don't like the way this change was approached. So, yeah. But that's just my take, and maybe take that with a grain of salt because it's coming from somebody who really doesn't like Revenant. Draconic Echoes is also getting reworked, so that instead of applying boons, it now gives you a unique effect depending on which facet you used. However, this does compete with Forceful Persistence, and if it's actually good enough to be comparable is yet to be seen. I really don't think it is. That's also almost it for Revenant. Renegade is getting one really nice utility change in that the Renegade Spirits can now no longer be CC'd, at least in PvE, which is really nice. Vindicator, on the other hand, is getting mostly Wilt as well changes. However, one really nice thing is Alliance Tactics. The thing that flips over your Alliance skills is getting reduced from 10 seconds to 3 seconds, so you can kind of actually use the Kurzik utility for stuff now. Maybe. This might add a little bit more utility, and is maybe interesting and fun for open world, but it's probably not going to affect a whole lot. Now on to Thief. In core, Thief is only getting some cute stuff, not particularly impactful, with some changes to the acrobatics trait line, including the introduction of a damage buff, and the improvisation trait in Deadly Arts getting reworked so that instead of recharging a random utility skill, it recharges all of your utility skills by a certain percentage whenever you steal. These are cool, but are probably only relevant to open world, but hey, cute nonetheless. Daredevil, next up, is getting some actually good stuff, and it was really needed, with both Bound, meaning the power dodge, and Staff auto attacks getting their damage buffed. Also, there are some weird changes around the stolen skills that I can't really comment on, but they're here. The only one that's really relevant is Detonate Plasma can no longer give quickness, so Boon Daredevil is now finally dead forever. Moving on to the really interesting stuff, Deadeye. Deadeye is getting a boon build. Specifically, Fire for Effect is being reworked, so that it now always gives you steal time whenever you steal. And all Deadeye stolen skills now apply their benefit not only to you, but to everyone around you. This means that with steal time, which remember you can get every time thanks to Fire for Effect, you can now grant everyone quickness. That duration has also been buffed from 3 to 5 seconds. And that is Quickness Deadeye. You steal, use the steal skill, that gives quickness, huzzah. It's compatible with all of the weapons, we'll see what the meta version ends up as. One in a Chamber now also increases the damage of stolen skills, and 2 of the cantrips have had slight reworks, with Shadow Flare now only pulsing damage once, and doing damage again when you use the flip over instead of continuously dealing damage, which means you will no longer randomly be revealed by your Shadow Flare, and Banning Shadow now having its cooldown reduced and doing Immobilize instead of Knockdown, which has some utility potential at least. Though the tooltip still says Knockdown, so I don't know what's up with that. And that's not it for exciting Thief changes, because the support versions of Spectre are essentially getting a rework. So first of all, they are obviously untying your Alacrity from your wells. Instead, they have reworked the Shade Step trait, which used to be the Res trait, to now instead apply Alacrity around your tethered target when you use a Shroud skill. It additionally will apply the tethered effects of your Shroud skills around the target instead of just on it. On top of that, something that's very easy to miss is that the ally targeted effects of Scepter skills will now do their effect to targets around the person you're targeting. To a lesser degree, so you're still keeping at least a little bit of that single target support theme, but your support is no longer single target and thus actually usable. Now, this is one that I unfortunately can't show off at all without actually getting into an organized fight, but it definitely is an enormous improvement that will make Support Spectre, or specifically Heal Spectre, actually possibly usable. It's no longer completely unfunctional as it has been before. It should also make Alacrity Spectre easier to use and more consistent, and you don't have to deal with the well teleporting anymore. So yeah, Thief and Ranger are probably the two classes that get the most exciting stuff from this patch. And we're finally at Warrior. Now, core Warrior changes are mostly made up of two things, which is one, all of the cooldown reduction stuff, won't go into detail on any of this, and two, the removal of all sources of quickness from core Warrior, including both from banners and from Martial Cadence. Martial Cadence now instead gives you stability, which is quite nice, and in the same trait line, Soldier's Comfort now also gives protection, which is at least cute, and possibly hinting in some Heal Warrior direction. I don't want to promise too much, but there is some stuff that could make that possible sometime in the future. This does also mean that Discipline is kind of a dead trade line for power builds now, because Tactics Strength is just better. The one thing that's kind of hidden among the cooldown changes here is that the rifle skills are getting a slight rework, where basically they're removing the main cooldown, and so you can fire your ammo shots really quickly, as though they are real bullets, and then having the stack recharge be the regular cooldown, which are also getting slightly buffed. If this will make rifle viable as a weapon, I don't know, but it is really cool. Flurry has also been changed, the sword F1. I don't know if this affects anything, because Berserker doesn't use this and nobody else runs a Condi build, so nobody else is using sword. I don't know why they changed this. They changed the animation for this, which might be a PvP thing, and then they had to change this in all game modes because the animation has to stay the same across all of them. That's just me speculating. Now, the elite spec things are going to go quite quickly, despite moving around the boons again. Berserker is inheriting the quickness, having the Heat the Soul trait reworked to now grant 5 seconds of quickness whenever you use a burst skill. It should be incredibly easy to upkeep quickness with this skill. To compensate for losing the Condi trait that this was previously, the Torch skills are having their cooldown reduced, and the Blood Reaction trait, which up till now gave you extra POW stats, which were doubled while you rage, now does a similar thing for Condi as well. So that's the damage trait on both versions, and the other one is becoming the Quickness DPS version. That still works with both Power and Condi. Additionally, Power Berserker is getting nerfs in a couple of different places, mostly Arc Divider and Bloody Roar, and thank fuck for that, because this benchmark, with how easy it was to play, how defensive it was, and how much potential utility it offered, was not okay. Spellbreaker, on the other hand, isn't getting anything interesting. Offhand Dagger is getting a little bit of extra utility, and that's it. Bladesworn is getting a single change, in which one of the traits is getting reworked, namely Daring Dragon, which before allowed you to do the altered version of the Dragon Slash, where you only can get half as many charges, then slash, and then immediately do it again. Now it's a different trait. You still can only charge to 5 on your Dragon Trigger, but now you grant Alacrity when you execute it. Daring Dragon as a damage trait was never going to work out just because Dragon Trigger scales exponentially, and you will never be able to make up the DPS loss from not having the extra 5 charges at the end. That's just not how exponential scaling works. So this was a good place to put it, and now Warrior does also have access to both Alacrity and Quickness DPS. And with that, I am finally done. I've been recording and editing the audio for almost 4 hours now, with my PC overheating my room the entire time. In closing, this patch is pretty wild. We've had a ton of new builds introduced with it, mostly new boon-based builds, but also Druid DPS, which I'm looking forward to trying very soon. It's hard to really recap this in total. The vision seems to be that they are taking away some of the very unique ends of various builds to make more of them viable at the same time and easier to balance. This applies to the confusion changes, this applies to the flanking changes, this applies to how Scourge was handled, this applies to how Untamed was handled, this applies to everyone getting both boons now and having that moved out of the core specs, but it also applies to little things like Ranger Spirits getting reworked so that you no longer have to deal with the timing and keeping them alive. It's all very much going in this direction. Whether you like this or not is up to you. I think there's pros and cons. I can't really go one way or the other. But it is certainly a thing that exists. The other thing I want to say is they've already announced a follow-up balance patch on the 18th of July, where they have already specifically called out Alacrity Mirage, Alacrity Willbender, and DPS Scourge as things they're looking at. I hope they're also looking at other stuff. The main ones that I'm concerned about are Heal Scourge is not going to have the tools to compete. Heal Scrapper is kind of getting screwed over by this whole thing. Quickness Herald might not go in a direction that is healthy. It might run into really similar problems as Paralacrity Mechanist did, and that's not good. But we'll have to see. I'm super interested in how things end up shaking out now. I'm super interested in trying all of the new builds. There's a lot of stuff I'm gonna have to record over this. So yeah. And as I said, I've been recording for over 4 hours and still have to do all of the editing. So if you want to reward that, if you found any of this interesting, please let me know so I know if it's worth doing again. And if you've listened to all of this, thank you very much, and goodbye.